Picture this, a cowboy riding the Chisholm Trail in 1878, his Colt single-action army riding high on his hip. Not low-slung like the movies show, not hanging off his thigh in some fancy drop holster. High on the belt, close to his ribs, where it won't catch on the saddle horn or slap against his leg during 12 hours of hard riding. That's the truth most people miss. In the real West, how a man carried his gun mattered more than what gun he carried. A holster wasn't about looking fast. It was about keeping your weapon secure, accessible, and out of the way while you did actual work, roping cattle, riding fence, driving a herd through dust storms and river crossings. Today, we're examining 14 gun rigs that actually existed on the frontier, and one that didn't. No myths, no fantasy quick-draw setups invented for silent films. Just the honest mechanics of how firearms were actually carried, and how one fake design eventually replaced them in popular memory. Number 15. The flap holster, the cavalry's standard protection. Before cowboy gun leather became an industry, military holsters set the pattern. The flap holster was standard issue for mounted troops from the 1850s through the 1880s, and thousands of surplus examples made their way into civilian hands after the Civil War. The design was simple, a leather pouch that completely covered the revolver with a wide flap that buckled down over the grip. Some had brass fittings. Most were plain cowhide, treated with tallow to shed water. The flap kept dust, rain, and trail grime out of the action, essential for percussion revolvers that could be ruined by a single drop of moisture in the wrong place. Civilian use was different. Settlers bought surplus flap holsters because they were cheap and durable. Trail hands wore them because that leather flap kept their Colt Navy or Army revolver protected during river crossings and dust storms. But for daily ranch work or town carry, the flap became a liability. Too slow, too many moving parts, too much to go wrong in a moment of trouble. Photographs from the 1870s show a mix. Some men still wearing flapped military holsters, others cutting the flaps off entirely to create crude, open-top rigs. The design worked for what it was built for, but the West demanded faster, simpler solutions. By the 1880s, the flap holster had become a relic, a reminder of an older era when protection from the elements mattered more than speed. Number 14. The shoulder holster, the concealed carry classic. Not every man on the frontier wore his gun where others could see it. Professional gamblers, detectives, traveling salesmen, and anyone who wanted to stay armed without advertising it turned to the shoulder holster. The design traces back to cavalry pommel holsters, adapted for crossbody wear under a coat. By the 1870s, commercial versions appeared in catalogs from Eastern firms like Shoverling and Daly, marketed as gentlemen's concealed rigs. Custom versions were stitched by tailors and leatherworkers in cities along the Mississippi and in rail towns across the plains. A typical shoulder rig used a leather harness with straps crossing the back and chest, supporting a holster under the left arm for a right-hand draw. The gun hung at an angle, gripped forward, easily reached through the opening of a coat or vest. Most were built for smaller revolvers, Colt pocket models, Remington Derringers, or compact .38s that wouldn't drag the rig down or create an obvious bulge. For Pinkerton agents riding the rails, it was ideal. A man could board a train in a suit and tie, his revolver invisible until he needed it. For gamblers working saloons in Dodge City or Deadwood, it kept their weapon close without breaking city ordinances that banned open carry. For anyone crossing dangerous territory without wanting to look like a target, it was insurance. The shoulder holster wasn't for cowboys. It was for men who lived by discretion, and when discretion failed, they needed a rig that wouldn't fail with it. Number 13. The belt slide, the working cowboy's simple carry. Most cowboys couldn't afford custom holsters, and many didn't need them. For everyday work on a ranch or short trail rides, the belt slide was good enough. The design appeared in the 1870s and stayed common through the turn of the century. It was nothing more than a shaped loop of leather with an open slot for a revolver barrel. The loop slid over a cartridge belt and gripped the gun by friction alone. No stitching, no metal hardware, no skirt or backing. just a piece of cowhide cut to shape, soaked in water, molded around a pistol frame, and hardened with tallow. A cowhand could cut one from saddle scrap leather and make it functional in an afternoon. Some added a leather thong to loop around the hammer for extra security. Others left them plain, trusting friction to hold the revolver in place during normal riding. But simplicity had limits. The leather stretched and softened quickly, especially in wet weather or during long, sweaty rides. After a few months of hard use, most belt slides lost their grip and had to be replaced or upgraded. They were temporary solutions, functional until payday allowed for something better, like a Slim Jim or a proper Mexican loop. The belt slide wasn't glamorous, but for working cowboys who needed a gun within reach but out of the way, it was honest, practical gear. Number 12. The tucked waistband, the improvised last resort. Sometimes a man didn't have a holster at all. Maybe he'd lost his rig in a river crossing. Maybe he'd borrowed a revolver and had nothing to carry it in. Or maybe he was traveling light and didn't want the weight of leather. In those situations, the oldest carry method in the world still worked, tucking the gun into the waistband. It wasn't a holster, it was desperation made practical. Still, in a pinch, it worked. A man without a holster could still keep his gun accessible. Outlaws used it because they didn't want to advertise that they were armed. Drifters used it because they couldn't afford leather. And anyone caught off guard could grab a borrowed gun and have it ready faster than searching for a proper rig. The tucked waistband wasn't a system, it was a compromise. But on a frontier where compromise often meant the difference between being armed and being helpless, even a bad solution was better than none. Number 11. The vest holster, the gambler's quiet edge. Inside the dim light of a saloon where money changed hands over cards and whiskey, professional gamblers needed protection that didn't announce itself. A gun on the hip drew too much attention. A shoulder rig could be spotted by sharp eyes. But a small holster sewn inside a vest? That was invisible until it needed to be seen. Custom tailors in cities like New Orleans, St. Louis, and San Francisco began adding hidden pockets and leather sleeves to waistcoats in the 1860s and 1870s. These weren't factory products. They were bespoke work stitched directly into the lining of a vest just behind the breast pocket. A gambler could slip 2 fingers inside, twist the barrel forward, and bring a derringer or pocket revolver into play before anyone at the table realized he'd moved. The most common pairing was a vest holster with a Philadelphia derringer or a Remington double barrel, small single or double shot pistols no more than 6 inches long, firing heavy .41 caliber rounds. Accuracy beyond arm's length was terrible, but in a crowded saloon where trouble started across a card table, that didn't matter. One shot at close range was often enough to end a quarrel or buy time to escape. Newspaper accounts from Deadwood, Dodge City, and Tombstone described gamblers producing derringers as if from thin air. That surprise was the point. A man who kept his weapon hidden controlled when the fight started, and that advantage could mean survival. But the design had severe limits. Reloading under pressure was impossible. The guns themselves were barely accurate beyond spitting distance. And if a gambler missed his first shot, or worse, if the percussion cap failed to fire, he had nothing left but words and luck. They remind us that the most dangerous men in the saloon didn't always reach for their belts. Sometimes they reached for their hearts. Number 10. The pommel holster, the pre-cowboy saddle carry. Before gun belts became standard, mounted men carried their revolvers on the saddle itself. The pommel holster, sometimes called a saddle holster, was the primary carry system for dragoons, Texas Rangers, and early settlers riding into the West. The system dates to the 1840s, when the first heavy Colt revolvers like the Walker and Dragoon models were too massive for belt carry. A loaded Colt Walker weighed over 4.5 pounds, far too heavy to wear all day while riding. The solution was to hang twin holsters from the saddle horn, one on each side, secured by straps looped through the pommel. But as lighter revolvers like the Colt Navy and 1860 Army appeared in the 1850s, the need for saddle-mounted holsters began to fade. Men wanted their sidearms on their bodies, not tied to their horses. By the Civil War, pommel holsters were already being replaced by belt rigs. Only cavalry units continued issuing them as standard equipment, and even then, many troopers privately bought their own belt holsters for convenience. Original pommel holster sets are rare but survive in museums. The Texas Ranger Hall of Fame, the Cody Firearms Museum. Their twin leather flaps are worn smooth from rains rubbing against them during long patrols. They mark the moment before the modern gun belt was born, when a man's holster was part of his horse, not his clothing. The pommel holster gave way to newer designs, but for decades it was the system that carried armed men into the West before cowboys ever existed. Number 9. The Mexican loop, the working cowboy's standard. When people picture a cowboy's gun belt, they're usually seeing the Mexican loop. It wasn't the first Western holster, but it became the most common, and for good reason. It worked. The design appeared in northern Mexico and the American Southwest during the 1870s. Local vaqueros and saddle makers, many trained in Spanish leatherwork, adapted older California patterns by adding a wide backing skirt behind the holster body. A slit cut through the skirt formed loops, and the holster pouch slid through those loops to lock it in place without stitching. The result was strong, flexible, and easy to repair on the trail. American leatherworkers like Maine and Winchester in San Francisco and Collins and Morrison in St. Louis adopted the design almost immediately. By the 1880s, it had become standard gear for cowhands and lawmen carrying Colt single-action armies and Smith and Wesson Frontier models. The extra skirt protected the gun from dust, sweat, and weather, while the open top allowed a clean draw when needed. The rig's distinctive curves and wide loops became a canvas for craftsmanship. Border stamping, tooled patterns, silver conchos, and dyed edges turned working gear into personal identity. Some were plain, built to survive years of hard use. Others were works of art, custom-made for men who took pride in their equipment. The Mexican loop defined the working West, not because it looked dramatic, but because it solved the practical problems cowboys faced every single day. Keep the gun secure, keep it accessible, keep it protected. Do all of that reliably, year after year. No other design matched it for sheer practicality. Number 8. The crossdraw holster, the horseman's smart solution. Of all the ways to carry a revolver in the Old West, the crossdraw might have been the smartest for mounted work. Instead of hanging a pistol on the dominant hand side, cowboys and lawmen wore it on the opposite hip, grip angled forward. The reason was simple: comfort in the saddle. When you spend 10 or 12 hours a day on horseback, a straight side holster digs into your leg and rubs raw. The crossdraw solved that problem. The revolver rested out of the way, and the grip stayed easy to reach even when reins or a lariat occupied the other hand. Drawing required reaching across the body in a smooth, sweeping motion, slower than the movie version, but far more practical for real work. This carry method was common among riders, teamsters, scouts, and some lawmen. It allowed for a controlled draw that didn't require twisting or fighting the saddle pommel. Famous names like Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson were known to favor the cross-draw position when traveling long distances, valuing accessibility over Hollywood-style speed. Cross-draw holsters usually rode high on the belt, sometimes secured with a simple leather thong looped around the hammer. They were plain leather, built to survive weather, dust, and years of use. No silver trim, no fancy tooling, just solid utility. Hollywood rarely showed it because the motion looked awkward on camera. But in the real West, function mattered more than appearance. The cross-draw was a holster built for riders, not showmen. Number 7. The high-ride holster, the real everyday carry. This was the standard, the everyday working holster of the Old West. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic, just a simple leather pouch that rode high on the belt, close to the ribs, keeping the revolver stable and out of the way. Cowboys wore their guns high for the same reason modern workers wear tool belts. It kept the equipment from interfering with the job. A revolver hanging low might look good in movies, but it slapped against the leg while walking caught on saddle horns while mounting, and bounced awkwardly during a gallop. High on the belt, the gun stayed put. These holsters were built for security first. Most covered the trigger guard completely and held the weapon tight with a simple leather thong looped over the hammer. A Colt .45 weighed nearly 3 pounds loaded, and carrying that weight all day required a snug fit. The high position distributed the load across the hip and belt, making long hours bearable. Lawmen, scouts, and trail hands all favored the high ride style because it worked. You could draw clean if needed, but the primary goal was retention, keeping the gun in place while roping cattle, climbing fences, or riding hard across rough country. Speed was secondary to reliability. The design was simple, a leather pouch stitched to fit a specific model of revolver, usually with a backing skirt to add stiffness and protect the gun from body sweat. Some had a belt loop, others used a slot that slid over a wide cartridge belt. Most were plain, untooled leather treated with oil or tallow to resist weather. Surviving examples show the reality of frontier carry. Museums hold high-ride holsters with worn edges, stretched leather, and repair stitching added in the field. These weren't temporary rigs or special occasion gear. They were daily equipment that had to survive years of use. The high-ride holster was practical, safe, and proven. It was the opposite of the flashy drop holsters Hollywood made famous. And that's exactly why it was the real choice of working men on the frontier. When your life depended on keeping your gun secure and ready, you didn't wear it for show. Number 6, the stagecoach guard rig, built for one job. Long before armored cars, the West's most valuable cargo rode in wooden coaches with a man and a shotgun on top. That guard's life depended on gear built for a very specific purpose: defending the strongbox while seated high on a moving stage. Wells Fargo and other stage lines issued custom rigs in the 1870s designed around 10 and 12-gauge double-barreled coach guns with 18 to 20-inch barrels. Instead of hanging from a belt, the shotgun rode in a wide leather loop, worn bandolier style, crossing from shoulder to opposite hip. The guard could draw and fire without standing up or dismounting, keeping both hands free to manage reins or grab the rails during rough travel. Company records describe these scabbards as heavy skirting leather, treated with tallow and reinforced with brass rivets. They were built by contract saddle makers in San Francisco, Sacramento, and Denver, each one custom fitted to the guard's specific shotgun. Some rigs included a cartridge slide sewn onto the shoulder strap for quick reloads, 2 spare shells within easy reach. The design had to secure the weapon even at full gallop. The muzzle slipped into a deep sheath near the hip, while the breech rested high across the chest, ready to swing forward in a single motion. Guards couldn't afford to fumble. If bandits hit the stage, the shotgun had to be in action within seconds. When your cargo was gold shipments and mail contracts, practical gear mattered more than anything else. Number 5, the Ranger belt and holster, the professional's setup. Long before Hollywood dressed heroes in silver conchos and drop loops, the men who actually lived by the gun developed their own standard: the Ranger belt and holster combination. It evolved in Texas during the 1870s, built by the Rangers who needed something stronger than the thin civilian straps sold back east. A proper Ranger belt used 2 layers of thick skirting leather, stitched together with rawhide or brass rivets to prevent stretching in the heat. Between those layers ran a strip of cartridge loops, each hand-cut to hold .44 or .45 rounds snugly. The holster attached high on the hip, closely fitted to a Colt single-action Army or similar large-frame revolver, angled slightly forward for a strong side draw. This wasn't flashy gear. It was working equipment built for men whose lives depended on seconds and leather. Period photographs show Rangers like Captain Leander McNelly and John B. Jones wearing versions of this setup during the violent years of border defense and outlaw pursuit. The design proved so reliable that commercial makers started offering Ranger-style belts by the 1880s. Firms like Hunter and Evans and Main and Winchester sold them to civilians who wanted professional-grade gear. Even U.S. military officers bought civilian Ranger belts for field use, preferring them to standard-issue equipment. The belt held ammunition close to the body where it stayed secure during hard riding. The holster kept the revolver high and tight, protected from weather but accessible when needed. No wasted motion, no unnecessary hardware, just solid construction that could survive years of patrol work. If the Buscadero was Hollywood's fantasy, the Ranger belt was the frontier's reality. The rig that truly earned the name gunslinger. Number 4. The Slim Jim, California's original quick draw. Before the low-slung Hollywood belt existed, California leatherworkers created the Slim Jim, the first holster actually designed for speed instead of ceremony. Born during the gold rush along the Sacramento and San Francisco trails, the Slim Jim was built for the Colt 1851 Navy and later the 1860 Army. Its design was minimal, an open-top pouch of heavy cowhide that gripped the revolver by friction alone. No flap, no skirt, no buckle to fumble with. Just a tapered leather pouch with a high ride that kept the gun tight against the body. Early makers like L.D. Nimschke and Main and Winchester hand-tooled floral patterns on some examples, but function came first. The leather was hardened with wax and tallow, so a man could reholster one-handed without the pouch collapsing. That innovation, a self-supporting holster, was revolutionary for its time. When the design spread east after 1858, Texans added a narrow belt loop and border stamping. By the 1870s, it had become standard gear for stage line guards and trail riders carrying the lighter .36 and .44 caliber revolvers, common before the peacemaker era. The Slim Jim worked because it eliminated complexity. Draw, fire, holster, nothing to unbuckle, nothing to tie down. For men who needed their guns accessible without bulk, it was perfect. But as heavier six-shooters like the Colt SAA became standard, the simple friction fit proved insufficient. The weight of a loaded .45 could pull the holster out of shape. That's when the Mexican loop appeared, borrowing the Slim Jim's clean lines, but adding reinforcement. The original California design faded, replaced by stronger patterns that could handle bigger guns. Authentic Slim Jims survive in museum collections, the Autry Museum, the Buffalo Bill Center. Simple, fast, and unprotected. They're darkened by sweat and age, proof of daily use by men who needed their guns ready. The Slim Jim was the West's first true quick-draw rig, decades before anyone called it that. It proved that speed mattered, but only when paired with security and reliability. Number 3, the Saddle Scabbard, the real rifle carry system. When most people picture a cowboy's weapon, they think of a revolver. But the rifle was far more important. A six-shooter was a backup. The rifle was the real tool for hunting, defense, and survival. And it wasn't carried on the back like in movies. It rode in a saddle scabbard. A saddle scabbard was a long leather sheath attached to the saddle's right side, angled forward so the rider could draw the rifle with one hand. The butt pointed backward, ready to be pulled free in seconds. It protected the gun from weather and dust while keeping it accessible if trouble appeared. Cowboys, scouts, soldiers, and stage drivers all used the same system. It worked for any long gun, Winchester repeaters, Sharps rifles, or cavalry carbines. The position was practical. The rifle stayed balanced with the horse's movement and didn't interfere with the rider's leg or snag on brush. Carrying it on the back, like Hollywood shows, was slow, awkward, and dangerous for both man and horse. Developed during the 1860s and standard by the 1870s, scabbards were made from thick cowhide, stitched by hand, and treated with tallow to resist moisture. Most were lashed to the saddle's pommel or skirt, held secure with rawhide thongs. Some had a reinforced throat where the barrel entered, lined with sheepskin or canvas to prevent wear. Trail accounts from the Chisholm Trail, drives, and military records from cavalry units mention riders who refused to travel without a scabbard. A lost rifle on the plains often meant a lost life, whether from predators, hostile encounters, or simple starvation when hunting became necessary. Recovered originals in museum collections show sweat stains and trail wear so deep the leather has fused to the form of specific rifle models. The Buffalo Bill Center of the West holds scabbards molded to Winchester 1873S, their shapes permanent after years of use. Many scabbards also held spare ammunition in a small pouch sewn near the throat, creating a portable armory for men who might be days away from resupply. The saddle scabbard wasn't a showpiece. It was essential equipment that turned the horse into part of the weapon system, allowing a rider to carry repeating firepower across 1,000 miles while keeping both hands free for the reins. On the frontier, a rifle in a scabbard was worth more than any revolver on a hip. Number 2, the California pattern, where the Western holster was born. Before Texas or Tombstone defined the gun belt, the first true Western holster came out of California during the Gold Rush. It was called the California pattern, and nearly every later design copied its foundation. Gold Rush saddle makers like Samuel H. Young of Stockton and Maine and Winchester of San Francisco built the pattern for Colt 1849 pocket models and 1851 navies. The holster was narrow, deeply contoured, and stitched to a backing skirt that spread the weight across the belt. For the first time, a revolver hung close to the hip instead of dangling from a flap. This change mattered. Miners and express riders could now sit a horse or climb a wagon without the gun swinging loose. The California pattern also introduced the reinforced throat, a double layer of waxed hide that let the shooter reholster one-handed, a critical innovation for mounted work. The craftsmanship set standards that lasted decades. Elegant border stamping, sunbursts, oak leaves, vine scrolls became the language of Western leatherwork. When the design traveled east along emigrant trails, Texans adapted it with heavier stitching and thicker skirts. That hybrid evolved into the Slim Jim and later the Mexican loop, but the original California pattern remained the blueprint. Surviving specimens in the Autry Museum and Buffalo Bill Center show the same hand-tooled details still copied by holster makers today. It was the first rig to turn necessity into style, proving that working gear could be both functional and beautiful. The California pattern was where the Western gun belt began. Every holster that followed owes something to those Gold Rush leatherworkers who figured out how to make a revolver ride properly on a working man's hip. Number 1, the Buscadero, Hollywood's biggest lie. If the Mexican loop was the real cowboy's holster, the Buscadero was the movie version, and it never existed on the frontier at all. The Buscadero rig was born in Hollywood, California, around 1922. Silent film costumers needed a lower riding belt that showed off the actor's revolver on camera. Leatherworker Ed Boland, a former Montana cowboy who'd opened a shop in Los Angeles, combined elements of the Mexican loop with a drop loop belt that hung the holster below the hip bone. It looked dramatic, it photographed well, and it had nothing to do with the real West. Early stars like Tom Mix, Buck Jones, and Ken Maynard wore Boland's creations, their quick draw scenes demanding visibility over authenticity. Movie posters and dime store toys spread the look worldwide, cementing the myth that every gunfighter wore a low-slung rig. But no photograph from the 19th century shows a working cowboy or lawman with a Buscadero-style drop holster. Real frontier fighters preferred high-ride rigs that kept the weapon secure during actual work. The low-slung design that defined Western movies was invented decades after the West had already changed. By the 1930s, Boland's Hollywood shop was producing Buscadero belts for both actors and actual ranchers who wanted to look like screen cowboys. His silver-studded originals are now museum pieces in the Autry Museum and National Cowboy Museum. The Buscadero became legend not because it was used on the frontier, but because it looked like what people wanted the West to be. Hollywood invented it, and the world believed the lie. It's the perfect symbol of how far the myths drifted from reality. The most iconic cowboy holster of all time never touched the real frontier. 15 gun rigs, some common across the plains, others rare but documented, all of them real. From the military flap holsters that protected percussion revolvers during long patrols, to the Mexican loops that became the working cowboy's standard, from concealed shoulder rigs worn by detectives to the improvised belt slides cut from saddle scrap. Each design solved a specific problem, keeping a weapon secure, accessible, and protected in conditions that destroyed anything fragile. The truth is simpler than the legends. Cowboys didn't wear their guns for show. They carried them in whatever way kept the weapon ready while they did actual work, roping, riding, driving cattle across hundreds of miles of open country. The rigs that survived were the ones that worked, day after day, through dust storms and river crossings and years of hard use. Hollywood gave us low-slung, quick-draw belts and silver conchos. The real West gave us high-ride holsters and plain leather worn dark with sweat. One was built for cameras, the other was built for survival. And when you look at the surviving artifacts, holsters stretched from use, leather darkened by decades of wear, stitching repaired multiple times in the field, you see the honest truth of frontier carry. These weren't symbols of masculinity or tools of intimidation. They were working equipment adapted to the environment and the job. The men who carried these rigs weren't trying to look like gunfighters. They were trying to stay alive long enough to finish the work. That's how the West was really armed. Not with drama and quick draws, but with leather, sweat, and the quiet practicality of men who understood that survival meant keeping your gun where it belonged. Secure, ready, and out of the way until the moment you had no other choice.